Tonight, we're pulling back the polished visor to explore why it actually kind of sucked to be a medieval knight. From back-breaking armor and brutal training to battlefield injuries, financial pressure, and the constant risk of disgrace, the life of a knight was often less fairy tale and more survival story. How heavy was that armor really? Did knights actually live in luxury? What happened if they failed in battle? And how did young boys even survive the training to become one? If you enjoy discovering the real, gritty truths behind romanticized history, you're in the right place. Before we charge into battle, take a second to like this video. It helps more history fans find the channel. Comment below, would you have what it takes to be a knight, or would you choose a different medieval job? And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss another deep dive into what life was really like in the past. When you're done watching, check out our related videos on medieval daily life, royal realities, and the surprising truths behind other legendary roles. Now, tighten your armor straps, mount your horse, and let's see what knighthood was truly like behind the legend. When you think of a medieval knight, what do you imagine? A shining suit of armor, a noble warrior on horseback, banners flying as crowds cheer. It's the image we see in movies and storybooks, brave heroes living lives of glory and honor. But the reality, it was far colder, far heavier, and far more uncomfortable. It's night in a great hall. The fire is low. The torches hum softly. And near the wall stands a suit of armor, tall, silver, perfect. It catches the light like it was made for a painting. This is the knight we remember still, polished, noble. If you close your eyes, you can almost hear the music swelling behind him. A trumpet call, a slow motion turn of the head, a visor lifting to reveal a calm, heroic face. That image did not come from the Middle Ages. It came later, much later, when people in the 1800s looked back at the medieval world and decided it needed better lighting. Writers like Sir Thomas Malory helped shape the legends, stories of King Arthur and his perfect round table, noble quests, holy swords, loyal brotherhood, clean armor, clean morals. It makes for great reading. It does not make for great reality. Because real knights did not stand still in warm halls waiting for destiny. They sweated. They owed money. They got sick. They backed the wrong lord and sometimes lost their heads for it. The armor you see in museums today, that's the polished version, the Sunday best. The display model. On campaign, armor smelled like old leather, damp cloth, and metal left too long in the rain. Knighthood was not just honor, it was logistics, it was contracts, it was debt, it was land agreements and feudal paperwork and horses that cost more than entire villages. But we like the clean version better. We like tournaments with bright banners, lances splintering in sunlight, crowds cheering as two mounted figures crash together in dramatic slow motion. What we don't imagine is what happens after: the bruised ribs, the broken collarbone, the concussion inside a steel helmet, the weeks of recovery, or worse, and we almost never imagine the waiting, because most medieval warfare was not a glorious charge across a field. It was sitting outside a castle wall for 5 months, while everyone inside slowly starved. It was mud, it was boredom, it was disease. It was watching your expensive warhorse develop a limp, and realizing that limp might cost you your life. The knight in the painting looks fearless. The knight in real life was often exhausted, and underneath all that steel, there was a person. Not a symbol, not a legend, a person shaped by pressure. From childhood, he was trained to be this thing, this weapon, this banner of honor. He did not wake up one morning and say, "I think I'll be a knight." He was born into it, and being born into it meant you inherited more than a title. You inherited expectation. You inherited debt. You inherited enemies. And sometimes you inherited wars that had nothing to do with you. Chivalry sounds soft when we say it now, almost poetic. Back then, it was closer to branding. It told people how you were supposed to behave. Brave, generous, loyal, devout. It also told them how to judge you. Fail publicly. That reputation followed you. Lose a battle. That followed you too. Run from a fight. You might as well move to another kingdom. Knights lived in a world where honor was currency, and currency could collapse overnight. And then there was religion. You were trained to kill, but also trained to fear eternal punishment. You prayed before battle, confessed before battle, wondered if the next blow you struck would stain more than your blade. The stories don't linger there. They skip ahead to victory feasts. Real life lingered, and that armor in the hall, it hides something else. Weight, not just physical weight. Though there was plenty of that. Steel plates layered over padding, helmets that turned your breath hot, gauntlets that stiffened your fingers, but also the weight of obligation to your lord, to your family name, to your reputation, to God. We imagine knights riding into glory. We rarely imagine them lying awake at night, wondering if the ransom for their capture would bankrupt their children, or wondering if backing the wrong political faction would end with a scaffold instead of a feast. The medieval knight has survived as a symbol because symbols are easier than people. A symbol does not get heat stroke. A symbol does not age. A symbol does not limp after 40. A symbol does not sit quietly after battle, staring at nothing. But the man inside the armor did all those things. And that's where we're going. Not into the legend. Into the life. We're going to step past the polished steel and into the mud beneath it. We're going to look at what it actually meant to grow up in this system. To train for it. To pay for it. To suffer through it. Because for every shining knight charging across a painting, there were dozens quietly enduring a reality that was far less cinematic. Knighthood could bring status. It could bring land. It could bring power. But it also brought risk. Financial risk. Physical risk. Political risk. Spiritual risk. And none of those risks cared how good you looked in armor. So the next time you picture a knight standing tall in a firelit hall, take a closer look. Imagine the sweat under the steel, the debt behind the sword, the pressure behind the posture, and the helmet comes off. The legend fades, and what's left is not a shining hero. It's a tired human being shaped by a system that demanded everything. And that system began very early, long before the armor, long before the horse. Long before the battlefield, it began with a child, and that child did not choose this life. Before the armor, before the horse, and before anyone called him sir, there was a 7-year-old boy holding back tears while trying to look brave. Because if you were born into a noble family in medieval Europe, your childhood did not really belong to you. It belonged to your future, and your future, most likely, was war. Around the age of 7, noble sons were sent away from home to serve in another lord's household. This was called becoming a page. It sounds gentle, almost like working in a library. It was not. This was political networking disguised as childhood. Your father sent you away to build alliances. You would grow up under the watch of another lord, learning loyalty to him, absorbing his values, his habits, his grudges. You were small, but you were already strategic. Imagine leaving home before your adult teeth have fully grown. No more sleeping in your own bed. No more running through familiar halls. No more mother smoothing your hair before sleep. Instead, you wake up in a drafty stone chamber filled with boys who are all competing for the same future. And competition starts early. As a page, your duties were not glamorous. You carried messages, served food at the Lord's table, practiced basic etiquette, learned how to bow correctly, how to speak carefully, how not to embarrass yourself or your family, because embarrassment traveled fast. You were watched constantly, every mistake quietly noted. Drop a goblet, clumsy, speak out of turn, disrespectful, show fear. Weak in fear was always nearby. Knights trained in the courtyard. Real weapons, real impact. You watched men bleed. You watched horses panic. You watched tempers flare. Violence was not hidden from you. It was normalized. You learned early that steel solves arguments. You also learned that you were expected to become the kind of man who could use it well. There was schooling, of course. Reading sometimes. Basic Latin, if you were fortunate. Religious instruction. You memorized prayers. You were told about honor, about loyalty, about bravery. Bravery was described as a virtue. No one explained that bravery often feels like terror that you are not allowed to show. Homesickness was not considered brave, so you swallowed it. At night, in a bed that wasn't yours, you listened to wind push through cracks in stone walls. You thought about home. You wondered if your younger siblings missed you. You did not cry loudly. Other boys would hear, and they were not your friends. Not really. They were future rivals. Every page hoped to become a squire. Every squire hoped to become a knight. There were only so many opportunities. Knighthood required money, equipment, a sponsor. Not every noble family could afford it, even if tradition suggested they should. So, from age 7, you were already in a quiet contest. Who rode better? Who listened better? Who impressed the Lord? Who didn't embarrass himself during drills, and who didn't embarrass himself during drills? Because yes, there were drills. You began learning horsemanship early, at first on smaller horses. Learning balance, learning posture, falling off, getting back on. You practiced with wooden swords, not light little toys, solid sticks that still hurt when someone swung too hard, and someone always swung too hard. Injuries happened. Bruises were common, occasionally worse. But sympathy was not part of the curriculum. If you wanted to be a knight one day, pain was simply preparation. There was also the subtle education, the one no one announced. You learned your place in the hierarchy. The lord at the top and his family, senior knights, household officers. You, and far below, the servants, the peasants, the people who worked the land that funded this entire structure. You were raised to see yourself as different from them, elevated, responsible, but that elevation came with strings. You were not just a boy, you were an investment. Your family had expectations. They had land tied to your name, maybe political ambitions resting on your shoulders. Imagine being 10 years old and already carrying generational pressure. No one asked if you preferred poetry to swords. No one asked if you liked horses. No one asked if the sound of metal clashing made your stomach tighten. You were being shaped into something very specific. a mounted warrior, a public symbol of strength, a representative of your family's honor. And here's the part that rarely makes it into movies. You had no guarantee it would work. Some boys were injured too badly in training to continue. Some families ran out of money. Some lords chose other favorites to advance. You could do everything right and still never be knighted, which means your entire childhood might be spent preparing for a role you never receive. That's a special kind of pressure, and let's not forget discipline. Medieval households were not gentle places. Correction could be physical. Expectations were rigid. Obedience was immediate. You learned to control your face, your tone, your reactions. Emotion was something to manage, not display, and especially fear. Because one day, when you were older, that fear would need to be invisible on a battlefield. The training began long before the battlefield. By the time you approached adolescence, you had already absorbed a worldview. Honor matters more than comfort. Reputation matters more than emotion. Obedience matters more than preference. You were told stories of great knights, of heroic charges, of glorious victories. You were not told how many of them died young, or how many were financially ruined, or how many limped home from wars that were not theirs. That information comes later. For now, you are a boy standing in a cold courtyard at dawn. Your hands ache from holding a practice sword. Your instructor corrects your stance for the 5th time. You straighten your back. You try again. Because this is not just training, it is transformation. You are being shaped into armor long before you ever wear steel. And soon, the training will intensify. Soon, you will move from serving at the table to serving at the side of a knight. Soon, mistakes will cost more than embarrassment. The childhood phase ends quietly. No ceremony. Just more responsibility, more expectation, and sharper blades. The path to knighthood does not begin with glory. It begins with a child learning, very early, that his life has already been decided, and he is expected to be grateful for it. Around 14, if you were fortunate, you stopped being the boy. Now you were a squire. That sounds impressive. It is slightly more impressive than page, but only slightly. Because becoming a squire did not mean you were closer to glory. It meant you were closer to danger. A squire was attached to a knight. Not metaphorically, practically. You followed him, served him, learned from him, cleaned up after him. You woke before he did. You made sure his armor was ready, and ready did not mean polished for beauty. It meant inspected for cracks. Leather straps checked, rivets tightened, mail repaired. Armor fails in small ways first. A loose strap becomes a broken strap. A broken strap becomes an exposed joint. An exposed joint becomes a wound. So you learn to pay attention to details that could kill someone, usually someone you were serving. You also cared for his horse. And this was not light work. War horses were massive animals, powerful, expensive, temperamental. If the horse trusted you, your job was easier. If it didn't, you might get kicked across a stable. You brushed it, fed it, checked hooves for stones, inspected tack, learned how much pressure was too much, how much slack was too little. Because when battle came, that animal would decide how long you lived. And while you did all this service work, your real education continued. You trained, harder now, no more wooden swords. Real steel, blunted, yes, but heavy, real weight, real impact. You learned how to mount quickly, in full gear. how to hold a lance steady while your entire body bounced with the movement of a charging horse. You learned how to fall. This is important, because you were going to fall. Falling from a horse at speed hurts. Falling in partial armor hurts more. Falling while someone swings at you hurts most of all. Bruises became routine. Broken fingers happened. Concussions were not understood the way they are now. You got up, or you were told to. There was no such thing as take the week off. You also followed your knight into real conflict. This is where the romance dissolves. You might ride with him on campaign. You might witness a siege. You might see a village burned because it supported the wrong lord. Siege warfare was education by exposure. You watched men starve behind walls. You watched ladders raised against stone. You watched arrows fall from the sky. You learned that war was less about cinematic charges and more about waiting. Waiting in mud, waiting in rain, waiting while disease crept through camp. You smelled things no storybook mentions: rotting food, rotting animals, rotting people. And your knight, the man you were meant to admire, was not always noble in the way poems suggest. He might be brave, yes. He might also be angry, petty, calculating. Afraid you saw him negotiate ransom prices. You saw him argue over land rights. You saw how much of knighthood was paperwork and politics wrapped around violence. As a squire, you were learning the trade, because that's what this was. A trade and not a calling, not a mystical destiny. A profession with entry costs, and here is the quiet truth. There was no guarantee you would graduate. Knighthood required more than skill. It required money. A full set of armor was expensive. A trained warhorse was expensive. Maintaining both was expensive. If your family could not afford the investment, you might remain a squire indefinitely, and some did. Skilled, experienced, capable, but without the ceremony, without the title. You could spend a decade training, bleeding, serving, and never hear the words that officially made you a knight. Imagine working toward something your whole life and discovering that economics decides the outcome, and then there was reputation. If your knight lost favor, you lost favor. If he backed the wrong political faction, you inherited that mistake. You were tethered to someone else's fortunes, so you learned another skill. Reading rooms, listening carefully, knowing when to speak, knowing when to disappear. You were becoming not just a fighter, but a social strategist, because survival in medieval society required more than muscle. It required timing. It required alliance. It required the ability to navigate feudal obligations that could drag you into conflicts that had nothing to do with you, all while still training daily with weapons that could shatter bone. And yes, there were moments of excitement. The first time you rode at full speed, with a lance lowered, heart pounding, wind in your face, that felt powerful. The first time you held your ground during a mock melee that felt like progress. But adrenaline fades. Responsibility stays. By your late teens, you were no longer a child playing at war. You were embedded in it. You had seen enough to understand that knighthood was not just a shining badge of honor. It was an obligation that followed you everywhere. It was debt waiting to happen. It was injury waiting to happen. It was politics waiting to happen, and still, you wanted it. Because this was the path laid before you. Because your family expected it. Because society defined your worth by it. Because turning away was not really an option. So you trained to served. You endured waiting for the moment when someone decided you were ready and waiting for the ceremony. Waiting to kneel and feel a blade tap your shoulder. waiting to officially become what you had been shaped to be since childhood, a knight. But before that moment arrives, there is something we need to talk about: money, because steel may look romantic, but it is very, very expensive. Let's clear something up first. Medieval plate armor was not a clunky metal prison that made you fall over like a tipped cupboard. That myth needs to retire. Good armor was surprisingly well balanced. The weight was distributed across the body, shoulders, hips, torso. A trained knight could run, mount a horse, even climb a ladder in it. But here's the key word: trained, and here's the other key word: exhausting. A full harness of 15th century plate could weigh around 45 to 60 pounds. That weight was not unbearable for a fit adult. Modern soldiers carry more, but soldiers can take their gear off when the patrol ends. A knight in active combat sometimes could not. First came the linen shirt, then the gambeson, thick, padded, quilted fabric, meant to absorb shock. Already warm, already heavy. Then mail, invulnerable gaps, then the plate itself: breastplate, backplate, spalders, vambraces, cuisses, greaves, each piece buckled tight, each piece limiting something slightly. Then the helmet. Ah, yes, the helmet. From the outside, it looks heroic. A visor shaped like a face of calm metal resolve. From the inside, it's a metal oven with limited air supply. Breath bounces back at you. Moisture builds. In summer, heat lingers. In winter, condensation chills your skin. Your field of vision narrows. Peripheral sight shrinks. Sounds echo strangely. Commands become muffled. Now imagine wearing that for hours, on a field, under the sun, heart pounding, adrenaline burning through your energy. Heat stroke was a real risk, especially during long engagements or sieges where armor stayed on for extended periods. And remember, hygiene was medieval. You sweat heavily under layers of cloth and steel. The gambeson absorbed it. It did not dry quickly. Skin infections were common. Rashes, chafing, sores along joints where metal rubbed during movement. Armor protected you from blades. It did not protect you from discomfort. And then there's fatigue. Moving in armor requires energy. Even small motions demand more effort. Lift your arm, you are lifting steel. Turn your torso, plates slide and shift. Over time, that drains you. Battlefields were not tidy duels. They were chaotic. You shoved, you stumbled, you wrestled. Sometimes fighting was less elegant swordplay and more grappling in mud. Falling in armor was survivable. Getting up in armor while someone tries to stab you, less pleasant. Knights trained for this. They practiced rising quickly. They strengthened legs and core. But exhaustion does not care about training. After prolonged combat, even small movements feel large. Your lungs burn, your shoulders ache, your hands cramp inside gauntlets, and yet you must appear steady, because fear spreads fast. And if the heavily armored elites start looking tired, everyone notices. Now let's talk about noise. Armor is not silent. It creaks, clinks, scrapes. Every movement produces a reminder that you are encased in metal. In the quiet of a siege night, that sound travels. Sleep in armor was possible, sometimes necessary, comfortable. No, you rest upright, or leaning against stone. Helmets off, if safe. But boots on, gauntlets nearby. Because surprise attacks happened, and scrambling into full gear in darkness is not cinematic. It is frantic. There is also maintenance. After battle, armor had to be cleaned. Blood corrodes, mud sticks in joints, moisture invites rust. A neglected harness weakens, so even after surviving a fight, the work continues. And here is the psychological piece. Armor creates distance. It hides your face. It makes you anonymous. That can be useful in combat. It can also be isolating. You are reduced to shape and motion, identified by heraldry rather than expression. Inside, you might be afraid. Outside, you look like a walking wall. People expect walls not to tremble, and yet beneath the steel, your body is still human. It overheats, it tires, it bruises. Because here's another thing. Armor does not make you invincible. Blunt force trauma still hurts. A strong mace strike might not pierce plate, but the shock transfers. Ribs crack, shoulders dislocate. You feel it, and after enough impacts, you carry that memory in your bones. Modern reenactors often describe the first few minutes in full armor as thrilling. Then comes the weight. Then comes the sweat. Then comes the realization that even standing still takes effort. Now multiply that by a real battlefield, by fear, by chaos, by the knowledge that if you stumble at the wrong time, someone will take advantage. Armor was brilliant engineering. It was also a commitment. Once fully equipped, you were not agile in the way stories imply. You were powerful, durable, intimidating, but you were also working harder for every motion. And when the sun beat down on steel for hours, when your breath turned hot and heavy behind a visor, when your muscles trembled from strain, the romance faded. You did not feel like a legend. You felt like a furnace with legs. And if you were lucky, your horse was still beneath you. Because if you lost the horse, the situation got much worse. Very quickly. Before you ever swing a sword in battle, before you ever charge across a field, you have to pay for the privilege. And this is where the dream starts sweating. Knighthood was not just a title. It was a financial commitment, a very serious one. Let's start with armor. By the late medieval period, a full suit of plate armor was a masterpiece of engineering. Articulated joints, reinforced breastplate, visor that could lift and lock. It also cost a small fortune. A high-quality harness of plate could equal several years of income for a skilled craftsman. And that's just the metal. Underneath, you needed a gambeson. Thick padded layers to absorb shock. Then mail in certain gaps. Then belts, straps, buckles. Then repairs. Constant repairs. Because metal dents, leather cracks, straps snap. Now add weapons. A sword was not cheap. A good one even less so. Lances were expendable. Shields split. Daggers disappeared in the chaos of battle. And then there was the horse. Not just any horse. A destrier. A trained warhorse bred for size, strength, and aggression. These animals were so valuable, they were often named in wills. Losing one in battle was like watching a bag of gold gallop off a cliff. A top-tier warhorse could cost as much as a modest estate. And you did not buy just one. You needed backups, a roundsy for travel, a palfrey for comfort, maybe a pack horse for supplies. Feeding them alone was expensive. Stable hands cost money. Armorers cost money. Blacksmiths cost money. Campaigning cost money. You didn't just show up to war alone. You often traveled with a small retinue, squires, servants, men-at-arms. You were expected to maintain a certain presence, because knighthood was not only about fighting, It was about status, and status has upkeep. Many knights relied on income from land, rents paid by peasants, agricultural yield, taxes, but harvests failed. Crops rotted. Weather did not respect feudal budgets. A bad year could destabilize everything. So knights borrowed. They took loans. They mortgaged land. They leveraged future income to pay for present steel. Knighthood looked glamorous. From the inside, it often felt like running a small military business with unpredictable revenue. And then came war. War was supposed to bring opportunity. Spoils, plunder, ransom. Yes, ransom. Here's where medieval warfare gets oddly corporate. Knights were valuable alive. If you captured a noble opponent, you didn't necessarily kill him. You negotiated. A ransom could equal years of income, sometimes more. This created a strange incentive structure. On the battlefield, you were both combatant and asset. If you were captured, your family had to pay for your release. If they couldn't, you might remain imprisoned for years, or worse. So every battle carried an invisible price tag. Victory meant profit. Maybe defeat meant debt. Almost certainly. Imagine riding into combat knowing that one unlucky fall could financially ruin your household. No pressure. And here's the quiet irony. Knights were considered elite warriors, symbols of power. Yet many lived in constant financial strain. Armor did not generate income. It consumed it. Horses did not produce wealth. They required it. Tournaments, which we'll get to later, were another gamble. Prize money was possible. So were broken bones and shattered equipment. And if you damaged your armor badly in a fight, repairing it was not simple. Plate had to be reshaped by skilled craftsmen. It cost time and silver. Even ceremonial events cost money. Feasts, travel, gifts. To secure alliances. Knighthood was a lifestyle brand, and lifestyle brands are expensive. Some knights thrived. They managed land wisely, married strategically, fought successfully. Others slowly drowned in obligations. There are records of knights selling parcels of land just to pay ransom debts, selling forests, selling mills, selling inheritance, all because one battle went poorly. We tend to imagine medieval society as static, but for a knight, it could feel unstable. You were one campaign away from wealth, or one campaign away from ruin. And the thing about ruin in the Middle Ages, there was no bankruptcy court, no safety net. If you fell far enough, you fell hard. Your children inherited that instability. Your family name carried the stain, all while you still had to look confident in polished steel. Because appearance mattered. A knight who looked poor was vulnerable. Status was armored too, so you maintained it, even if it meant more borrowing, even if it meant gambling on the next campaign to fix the last one. Knighthood was not a stable salary. It was high risk, high cost, unpredictable return, and that pressure never left. You might be admired by peasants. You might be envied by lesser nobles. But at night, you did math. How much did the new horse cost? How much will the armor repair be? How much can we extract from rents this season without causing unrest? Honor may have been your public currency. Silver was the private one, and you needed both. Because without money, there was no armor. Without armor, there was no battlefield survival. Without battlefield survival, there was no reputation. And without reputation, there was no knighthood. It was a cycle, expensive, fragile, relentless. So when people imagine knights as carefree warriors charging toward destiny, it's worth remembering they were also managing budgets. And budgets, unlike legends, are not romantic. But even if you could afford all of it, even if your land was productive, even if your debts were manageable, there was still one unavoidable truth. You had to wear the armor, and wearing it was its own kind of suffering. If armor was your second skin, the horse was your second life. Knights were cavalry. That's the core of it. Without the horse, you were just a heavily dressed man with limited cardio, and not just any horse would do. The ideal mount was a destrier, large, strong, trained for chaos. These animals were not gentle farm horses. They were conditioned to charge toward noise, not away from it, to tolerate the clash of steel, the scream of men, the smell of blood. Training a warhorse took years, and money. A good destrier could cost as much as a small estate. In some records, they were priced higher than full suits of armor. So imagine this. You are riding into battle on something worth more than most peasants will ever see in their lifetime. And everyone knows it, because enemy soldiers were not stupid. They understood that if you want to neutralize a knight, you target the horse. Arrows aimed low, pikes angled forward, trip hazards set deliberately. A fallen horse creates chaos. And if you've never seen a horse collapse mid-charge, let's just say it's not graceful. It's sudden, it's heavy, it's loud. And if you're on top of it when it falls, you might land under it. A fully armored knight pinned beneath a dying warhorse is not a heroic image. It's terrifying. If you survive the fall, you now face another problem. You are on foot, in armor, surrounded by lighter infantry. This is where legends start sweating. Knights trained for mounted combat. Lances delivered force through speed and weight. On foot, that advantage shrinks. You can still fight. You are not helpless. But your battlefield identity just changed, and you are tired, because cavalry charges are not casual strolls. They require coordination, timing, trust in the horse beneath you. You lean forward, lower the lance. The ground shakes. The wind tears at your surcoat. For a few seconds, it feels powerful. Then impact. Sometimes clean, sometimes chaotic. Sometimes you break through, sometimes you don't. And if your horse is injured, even slightly, that affects everything. A limping destrier is not just inconvenient, it is dangerous. You might lose maneuverability, speed, stability, and remember how expensive this animal was. If it dies, replacing it is not simple. There is also attachment. Warhorses were not disposable tools. Knights often formed bonds with them, trained with them daily, trusted them in moments where hesitation meant death. Losing a horse could feel personal, and then there's logistics. Horses require constant care, food, water, grooming, hoof maintenance, proper rest. Campaigns stretched resources thin. Grasslands could be stripped bare by large armies. If forage ran low, horses weakened. A weak horse means a weak cavalry. So while stories focus on swordplay, much of a knight's survival depended on agricultural supply chains. Not glamorous, very important. In some battles, entire cavalry units became ineffective because terrain turned against them. Mudfields swallowed hooves. Uneven ground broke formation. Marshy areas made charging impossible. The medieval world did not come with smooth, flat battlegrounds designed for dramatic camera angles. Sometimes it was just wet earth and regret. And let's not forget fear. Horses are brave, but they are animals. They can panic. A sudden noise, a fire, a collapsing formation nearby. A spooked warhorse can throw a rider or a bolt unpredictably. Now imagine managing that while wearing 50 pounds of steel. So yes, the mounted knight looked impressive. High above infantry, banner flying, armor gleaming. But that image depended entirely on a living creature with its own instincts. If the horse holds steady, you are dominant. If the horse falters, you are vulnerable. Entire military doctrines evolved around this fact. Infantry formations learned to counter cavalry. Pikes extended outward, like a forest of sharp branches. Longbows targeted mounts from distance. Knights adapted. They added barding armor for the horse, heavy protective plates, and padded coverings, which added more weight, which required stronger horses, which required more feeding, which required more money. The cycle never ended. You were only as powerful as the animal beneath you. And the battlefield was not kind to animals. Arrows do not care about nobility. Spears do not respect investment. And when a horse screamed, truly screamed, on a medieval field, that sound carried. It cut through the noise. It reminded everyone that beneath the banners and coats of arms, this was still flesh and bone. Mounted warfare gave knights their edge. It also gave them a weakness. Lose the horse, and the legend cracks. Suddenly you are a man in heavy armor trying to stand up while the world rushes at you. And most medieval warfare, despite what paintings show, did not even begin with glorious charges, because often there was no charge at all. Just waiting outside a wall, in the mud, for months. And that kind of war. It drained you in ways armor never could. If you imagine medieval war as two neat lines of soldiers charging toward each other at sunrise, I regret to inform you that medieval war was mostly waiting outside a wall, waiting in the rain, waiting while supplies ran low and morale ran lower, because the dominant form of warfare in much of the Middle Ages was siege warfare. Castles were everywhere, stone fortifications on hills, walled towns, keeps designed not for beauty, but for patience. And patience was the weapon. Instead of glorious cavalry charges, many campaigns involved surrounding a fortress and cutting off food. That's it. You waited. You watched. You hoped hunger would do what swords could not. This could take weeks, months, sometimes longer. And while you waited, life did not pause. You still had to eat. Horses still needed feed. Armor still needed maintenance. Tempers still flared. Armies camped in open fields. Tents flapped in cold wind. Rain turned ground into sludge. Latrines filled quickly. Sanitation was limited, which means disease became a bigger threat than enemy blades. Dysentery was common. Fever spread easily. Water sources could become contaminated. You might survive a dozen skirmishes only to be defeated by bad water. Not exactly the epic ending the bards promised. Inside the besieged castle, conditions were worse. Food rationed, animals slaughtered early to conserve grain, civilians trapped alongside soldiers. You could sometimes hear them from outside. The noise of desperation carries, and knights were part of this system. They oversaw blockades, led raids against supply lines, negotiated surrender terms. There were occasional assaults, ladders raised against walls, Siege towers rolled forward. Catapults launched stones. Those moments were violent and loud, but between them, silence. Long stretches of boredom mixed with anxiety. Imagine waking up every day not knowing if today is the day of assault, or if today is just another day of mud. Knights were trained for action. Sieges required endurance, and boredom is not harmless. Idle soldiers gamble, argue, drink when supplies allow. Discipline slips. Knights were expected to maintain order among men who were tired, frustrated, and far from home. It was leadership without glory. Then there were raids. Instead of attacking the main castle, armies often targeted surrounding villages. Burn crops, seize livestock, pressure the enemy economically, which meant knights, the supposed protectors of the realm, sometimes rode through peasant fields, setting fire to wheat. War was strategic. It was also brutal, and rarely clean. There were no clear battle start times, no dramatic countdowns. Sometimes skirmishes broke out unexpectedly. A scouting party meets another. A misunderstanding escalates. Suddenly steel is drawn in ankle-deep mud. You fight tired. You fight damp. You fight because if you don't, someone else controls the land that funds your armor. And then there is fear. Not cinematic fear. Slow fear. The kind that builds when you lie awake in a tent listening to distant movement beyond the camp. The kind that creeps in when rations shrink. The kind that grows when disease spreads through your ranks, and you realize the enemy has not lifted a weapon. Knights were not immune to this. Under the armor was the same human nervous system as anyone else's. Waiting amplifies imagination. You think about home. You think about debt. You think about the last man who fell from a ladder and did not get back up. You think about whether this campaign will pay off financially or bankrupt you. And when assault finally comes, it is rarely orderly. Scaling walls is chaos. Stones drop from above. Boiling substances are poured. Arrows rain downward. Ladders slip. Armor helps. It does not make you immune to gravity. Fall from a wall in full gear, and you will feel it for months, if you survive. Siege warfare drained resources and morale. Even victorious campaigns left scars. Horses thinner, men weaker, equipment worn down. And then, after months of tension, the castle might surrender without a grand battle at all. Negotiations, terms agreed, hostages exchanged, ransom arranged, and the long campaign ends not with a clash, but with paperwork. Medieval war was often administrative violence, slow pressure, economic strangulation, occasional explosive brutality. Knights were central to it, but they were not always charging heroes. They were managers of prolonged suffering, and sometimes, despite all precautions, despite all strategy, they were captured. And that is when things became very expensive. Imagine this. You've survived the battlefield. You've managed to ride out in armor, your horse limping but alive, your helmet dented but intact. You've fought bravely, maybe even heroically, and finally, just maybe, you can breathe. Victory, or at least survival, has touched your shoulder, and then someone swings a spear, or maybe not. Maybe it's just luck. Because the moment a knight is on the ground, exhausted, or even just separated from the chaos of battle, the danger doesn't stop. In fact, it becomes oddly, financially more dangerous. Because in medieval warfare, being captured was often preferable to being killed. That's right. The richer you looked, the more likely someone would take you alive. Why? Ransom, money, cold, hard, bloody cash. A captured knight was not a liability. He was a liquid asset, a walking ATM with armor, a sword, a warhorse, and a noble name. His value wasn't in the damage he could do anymore. It was in the price someone would pay to get him back. And suddenly, survival wasn't just about swinging a sword. It was about arithmetic. Ransom could be small. It could also be enormous. Some records indicate that a mid-ranking knight might cost the equivalent of several years of income from a moderate estate. Higher-ranking nobles or famous warriors could command sums that would make even kings pause. You think your rent is expensive? Try thousands of silver marks, negotiated in ink and sweat. Families scrambled, estates were mortgaged, lands sold. Sometimes, the captured knight's family had to borrow from other nobles to pay the ransom, basically. Medieval payday loans, with very sharp consequences if you didn't pay. Your farm might be collateral, your forest pledged, your future inheritance endangered. And it wasn't just the financial pain, there was social pressure too. Imagine being a young squire turned a knight, suddenly helpless in a dark, cold tower, hearing rumors of negotiations, knowing that your family is selling everything they own just to keep you alive. It's not exactly a heroic tale. It's anxiety packaged in Inside the prison, conditions varied. Some nights were treated decently, fed, given straw to sleep on, perhaps allowed some comfort because their captors wanted to preserve their value. Others, not so much. Dark stone walls, damp floors, cold air sneaking through cracks. Guards, indifferent to anything beyond their instructions. Boredom and fear as much of a weapon as anything else. You can get used to the physical pain of battle, but mental stress doesn't have padding. Now, here's the tricky part. The negotiation itself. Ransom was not just a payment. It was a delicate dance of pride, politics, and pure calculation. Your captors had to figure out how much you were worth. Too low, and they missed profit. Too high, and the family balked or delayed, risking the knight's life. Every letter exchanged, every messenger dispatched, carried tension. One misstep, one misworded phrase, and the deal could collapse. Sometimes the process dragged on for months, years, in extreme cases. Meanwhile, the captive knight had plenty of time to reflect, not on the battlefield's glory, but on the precariousness of social status. After all, your survival hinged not on your valor or skill, but on your bank account and your family's influence. That's a humbling realization for anyone who thought they were invincible in plate armor. Let's pause to consider how this affected the mindset of knights. You spend your life training to fight, to endure, to embody courage and honor. And yet here you are chained, waiting entirely dependent on someone else's willingness to pay money. It's an existential plot twist. Chivalry promised glory. Reality promised humiliation and debt. For families, this wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was economic. Landowners had to calculate risk before every campaign. Sending a son or husband into war meant preparing for the possibility that their capture would trigger months of negotiation and years of financial strain. Estates were sometimes split just to pay a single ransom. Peasant tenants might be overtaxed to cover obligations. Entire villages felt the ripple effects of one night's misfortune. Some ransoms were cleverly structured. Not a single lump sum, but staggered payments. Partial release for partial payment. Guarantees in writing. Sometimes even hostages were exchanged to ensure that terms were met. Medieval Europe was surprisingly sophisticated when it came to financial risk management. You just had to be in the unfortunate position of being the risk itself. And for the knight, surviving captivity could carry lasting consequences. If the ransom drained your family's wealth, your post-release life was immediately constrained. You might be indebted, reliant on allies, politically vulnerable. Some knights never fully recovered. They returned to a life where their freedom was technically restored, but their resources, influence, and sometimes even their reputation were gone. We might chuckle at the notion of negotiating one's own freedom like a stock transaction. But consider, the medieval battlefield was always a mix of honor and pragmatism. A knight's value was always tied to social hierarchy, someone worth killing outright because they were a threat. Rarely, someone whose ransom could fund campaigns or maintain social leverage. Priceless. Ransom culture also changed tactics. Enemy commanders often aimed to capture, not kill, high-ranking knights. Sometimes armies deliberately preserved the lives of valuable captives while slaughtering lower-ranking soldiers. Survival thus became less a matter of heroism and more a matter of luck, positioning, and the attention you attracted from enemy nobility. This brings us to another layer, the ethics of warfare. Knights were expected to fight honorably, to follow codes of chivalry, which, ironically, included preserving the lives of valuable enemies. A wounded or captured knight was a bargaining chip. Kill him outright, and you lose future profit. Spare him, and you enter a moral economic calculus that could last months. The battlefield became a strange mix of combat, business, and diplomacy. And here's the final twist. Sometimes the ransom process created a kind of social theater. Negotiations happened publicly, sometimes in the presence of witnesses. Prestige, face, and family reputation mattered as much as the silver. A knight released without adequate ceremony might be mocked, undermining authority. Conversely, a dramatic return, paid for in gold, could elevate status if the family survived the expense. In other words, survival came with strings. Tangible, visible strings attached to debt, social expectation, and political consequence. Knights did not simply escape the battlefield. They entered another arena where wealth, negotiation skill, and timing dictated life and death. And yes, humor can be found here if you squint. The idea that someone could train for decades in combat, master war horses, wield lances, and then be completely powerless, while lawyers, or their medieval equivalent, haggled over their fate. It's absurd, it's ironic, it's human. So when we look at the knight in shining armor, remember this. The moment the battlefield ends, the real test begins. Can your family pay? Can your allies negotiate? Can your captors be trusted? A sword cannot answer these questions. Valor cannot. Only money, influence, and patience can. Ransom defines survival as much as combat. A knight who returned home physically unscathed might still be bankrupt, or politically weakened, or socially diminished. The price of being valuable could outweigh the prize of living. And yet, families accepted this risk because knighthood carried prestige, because societal expectations left few alternatives, because glory and duty outweighed financial pragmatism, at least in theory. In the end, being captured was a reminder of a hard truth. Knighthood was never just about fighting. It was about risk, about wealth, about connections, about surviving not only the enemy's sword, but the invisible chains of economics and reputation. So next time you imagine a knight riding valiantly into battle, remember, for every victorious charge, there was the looming threat of capture, and with it, a slow, exhausting, and often humiliating negotiation that could cost more than a life. Steel could save your body. Money had to save your future. The battlefield might have ended, but the war of ransom had just begun. And that war was every bit as merciless as any sword swing. When most people think of medieval knights, they imagine grand tournaments, flags waving in the wind, horses prancing in polished armor, lances snapping on contact, a crowd cheering, the smell of roasting meat and excitement in the air. And yes, it's a very cinematic image. But here's the reality. Tournaments were a spectacularly dangerous form of recreation. In fact, fun might be the wrong word. Think more along the lines of organized chaos, where broken bones and death were very real possibilities. Tournaments began as a form of military training, disguised as pageantry. They were meant to practice the skills needed in real warfare, horsemanship, weapon handling, and group combat tactics. Over time, they became public spectacles, a chance to demonstrate skill, impress nobility, and, if you were lucky, gain some prizes or prestige. The earliest tournaments were less jousting and more, well, think of a controlled brawl, a chaotic melee where dozens of knights clashed in a confined field. Shields smashed, swords swung, men tumbled into mud, horses collided, and somewhere in the middle, you hoped you wouldn't be the one pinned under a warhorse while someone else's lance aimed at your helmet. In fact, injuries were almost inevitable. Broken limbs were common, concussions frequent, fatalities not unusual. Chronic injuries accumulated over repeated tournaments. Unlike a staged sporting event today, there were no paramedics standing by, no padding beyond your armor, no instant medical care. A simple fall could become life-threatening. Infection could set in, often more dangerous than the initial injury itself. And then there was the financial risk. Participating in a tournament required a significant investment. You had to outfit yourself fully. Armor, weapons, horse trappings, all in pristine condition. Horses, especially destriers, trained for jousting, were expensive. A tournament-ready lance was a specialized weapon. Shields had to be prepared. Even traveling to the event meant paying retainers, food for your retinue, and lodging. This was not a casual weekend hobby. You could literally bankrupt yourself for the chance to tilt at another knight in front of an audience. Yet, despite the risks, knights were drawn to tournaments. They were social events, opportunities to showcase skill and courage. They could improve reputation, earn favor with powerful lords, or even gain marriage prospects. Prestige was currency, and prestige could sometimes buy survival, influence, or opportunity. In a world where economic and political fortunes were precarious, tournaments were both a gamble and an investment. Let's talk about jousting, the part most people romanticize. Two knights on horseback, lance in hand, aiming to unseat the other. Sounds simple, not at all. Jousting required precise timing, balance, and control under extreme stress. Horses had to charge straight at each other at full speed. Lances, often tipped with blunted points, were intended to strike with force. But blunt tips could still break bones. A misaligned hit could crush ribs, shatter shoulders, or impale the unprotected hand. And sometimes the blunted tip was not so blunted. Accidents happened. Fatal injuries occurred. Helmets cracked. Shields splintered. Horses were injured or killed. spectators could be harmed by stray weapons. In essence, a joust was a controlled disaster, elegantly choreographed for spectators but deadly in execution. Then there were the Malays group fights that resembled miniature battles. Sometimes knights were divided into teams. Other times it was a free-for-all. Armor did not make you invincible. Being thrown from a horse, trampled, or struck by a careless blade could be fatal. And unlike a battlefield, there were no strategic retreats. Stepping out of bounds often meant losing face and honor. The chaos of these events cannot be overstated. Imagine dozens of armored men, horses sliding in mud, shouting, clanging, and struggling to maintain balance. Helmets restricted vision, armor restricted movement. Horses panicked at sudden noises or collisions. And yet, knights had to act as if everything was perfectly under control. Public perception mattered. Being unseated or injured in front of peers could be humiliating, even if no one died. Tournaments also carried political weight. Lords would sponsor or attend them, using them to display power, negotiate alliances, or test the abilities of potential vassals. Victory could elevate a knight's standing. Defeat could damage reputation or relationships. Social maneuvering was as important as combat skill. A well-placed lance strike might impress a powerful patron. A misstep might alienate allies. In this way, tournaments were microcosms of court politics played out on the field of mud and blood. Financially, tournaments could be ruinous. Losing a horse or damaging armor could cost as much as months of income. Some knights bet on outcomes, increasing risk further. A poor showing could leave a knight in debt, reliant on family or sponsors to recover. And yet, the lure of prestige and opportunity was irresistible. Human vanity and ambition are constants, even when survival is at stake. There was also the psychological element. Unlike the battlefield, where danger was external and urgent, tournaments were deliberate. Prolonged exposure to controlled danger. You knew the risks. You chose to participate. That creates a unique stress. Adrenaline mixes with anticipation. Every charge is calculated, but the margin for error is slim. Every competitor is both a friend and a potential threat. That tension, combined with the pressure to perform for spectators, could be mentally exhausting. And speaking of spectators, tournaments were social theater. Noble audiences, royalty, and sometimes commoners watched, cheered, and judged. Pageantry mattered. Heraldic colors had to be displayed correctly, armor polished, horses groomed, conduct elegant. Victory had to appear effortless. Failure could not only damage reputation but also invite ridicule. Social stakes were as high as physical ones. Despite all this, tournaments were widely popular. Chroniclers wrote of famous victories, dramatic jousts, and heroic feats. Ballads romanticized them. Children imagined themselves riding destriers and wielding lances with perfect aim. And yes, in certain moments, there was genuine skill, beauty, and spectacle. But underneath the glamour was a grueling, expensive, and potentially lethal enterprise. Some historians estimate that injury rates in tournaments were comparable to, if not higher than, those in actual warfare for knights. Broken limbs, concussions, and permanent disability were common. And unlike battle, there was no clear mission success beyond personal or familial prestige. You could risk life and limb just for applause. Yet, knights persisted, perhaps because prestige, honor, and visibility were as vital as survival. Perhaps because humans have always been drawn to controlled risk and spectacle. Perhaps because tournaments were a rare moment when knights could exercise autonomy, choosing who to fight, how to present themselves, and how to perform bravery in front of an audience. In the end, tournaments were not just sport. They were training, social theater, political arena, and economic gamble, all rolled into one muddy, bloody, unpredictable event. You might gain fame, you might gain wealth, you might gain respect, or you might gain a broken arm, a ruined horse, a shattered helmet, and a story of humiliation that travels faster than any armor could protect you. So next time someone imagines medieval knights jousting gracefully under a sunny sky, remember this. Beneath the polished steel and waving banners was a calculated gamble. Every charge could lead to glory or ruin. Every melee could result in laughter or tragedy. Every tournament was entertainment that could kill you, literally. And yet, for all the danger, for all the expense, for all the sweat, blood, and tears, knights continued to tilt, clash, and compete. Because in a world built on status, honor, and spectacle, the risk was worth the reward, or at least, society told them it was. And perhaps, in those fleeting moments of victory, they could forget about the debts, the battles, and the unrelenting weight of steel that defined their lives. In other words, tournaments were fun. If by fun you mean terrifying, expensive, and potentially fatal, the kind of fun you tell your grandchildren about, but only after decades of recovery. If you've been picturing knights as shining paragons of virtue, galloping to defend the weak and uphold justice, here's a little truth bomb. Medieval chivalry was less a personal code and more a social performance. In short, it was the original LinkedIn. Only instead of endorsements and recommendations, you had Lance's armor and the occasional duel. The code of chivalry wasn't a law written down in one neat book. It was a patchwork of ideals, customs, and expectations. Some religious, some feudal, some just plain social theater. And for the average knight, it was exhausting. The code demanded courage, loyalty, generosity, honor, courtesy toward women, piety, and the ability to fight like a demon on horseback all at once. And remember, failure was visible. Everyone saw it. Let's start with loyalty. A knight's allegiance was supposed to be unwavering, but the reality was murky. Feudal obligations often collided. One lord demanded your service here, another required your sword there. Conflicting commands were common. Following one meant offending another, and offending the wrong lord. That could be fatal. Chivalry demanded loyalty, but the political world demanded practicism. Navigating that tightrope often left knights in uncomfortable positions. Imagine trying to please multiple bosses at the same time, except the penalties weren't HR complaints. They were sharp swords or loss of lands. Then there was the expectation of bravery. A knight was supposed to be fearless, charging into battle without hesitation. But real life isn't a storybook. Fear is a natural human response to swords, arrows, boiling oil, and falling horses. Knights felt fear, but societal expectations meant showing it publicly could ruin your reputation. So many knights fought, exhausted, terrified, and sick, but had to maintain the outward appearance of courage. Public perception mattered as much as survival. Sometimes, the bravest act was not fleeing, but pretending you weren't terrified while quietly praying to survive. Generosity and courtly manners were also part of the package. Knights were expected to protect the weak peasants, widows, children, and to treat women with respect and deference. In practice, this often conflicted with survival. Protecting civilians from marauding armies wasn't always possible, and courtly love, the idealized romantic gestures toward noble women, added a layer of performative stress. You were supposed to be deadly in combat, pious in the chapel, and poetically charming in the hall. It was multitasking at a lethal level. Religion loomed over everything. A knight's actions were judged not only by peers, but by God. You were expected to fight justly, uphold the church's teachings, and participate in crusades when called. Confession, penance, and indulgences became part of the routine. You had to reconcile killing people, sometimes innocents or enemies considered righteous by their own faith, with the promise of eternal salvation. That mental gymnastics, it would give any modern therapist a headache. The social surveillance aspect was relentless. Your behavior was constantly observed by other knights, by lords, by clerics, by peasants, and by chroniclers who might write about you in ways that could either immortalize or embarrass you. Every decision carried weight. Miss a salute, lose honor, fail to protect a neighbor, lose respect, win a joust, but look arrogant, lose credibility. In a world where reputation could dictate survival, the code of chivalry was more than moral guidance. It was a social contract enforced by judgment, rumor, and gossip. It wasn't just about doing the right thing. It was about appearing to do the right thing. Sometimes, that meant performing acts of generosity or piety that were public spectacles rather than private virtues. Knights participated in tournaments, sponsored charities, or donated to churches, partly out of genuine goodwill, but also because appearances mattered. Public virtue was a form of currency. Private brutality was often overlooked if you maintained the show. Now let's talk about courtly love, one of the more entertainingly complicated parts of chivalry. Knights were supposed to idealize and serve noble ladies, often from afar, through gestures, poems, or symbolic service. Think of it like a sponsorship deal, except instead of money, you were offering devotion, poetic praise, and occasional heroics. It could be emotionally taxing, confusing, and sometimes humiliating. And often, the lady in question had little say in the matter. The whole system functioned as a social performance, reinforcing hierarchy and providing moral lessons if you could survive the pressure. Chivalry also reinforced hierarchy and obedience. You weren't just loyal to your lord. You were part of a broader social order that demanded proper conduct toward superiors and inferiors alike. The rules were complex. Treat your lord's family with respect. Avoid insulting another knight. Maintain composure under stress. Neglect any of these, and gossip, retaliation, or loss of status awaited. It was a game with very high stakes. The psychological toll of this expectation cannot be understated. Knights had to maintain a constant performance of courage, honor, and piety while living a life of debt, danger, and uncertainty. Failures were public. Successes could be fleeting. The weight of societal expectation often pressed as heavily as any armor. And yet the system worked, at least in the sense that it kept knights in line. Chivalry functioned as social control, ensuring that violence was conducted in a regulated, hierarchical manner. It encouraged knights to fight for the right causes, to protect property and honor, and to avoid completely random brutality, even if enforcement was inconsistent. It was both aspirational and coercive, a mixture of ideal and expectation, morality and performance. Humor, if you want to look for it, is easy to find here. A knight could charge into battle heroically, save a village from marauders, and then get scolded at court for failing to bow properly to a noblewoman. Or he could fight valiantly for weeks, survive a siege, and then lose face because a rival lord claimed he was impolite at a feast. Imagine a modern superhero being criticized for improper table etiquette after saving the city. That's chivalry. The gap between ideal and reality also created stories. Chroniclers loved tales of knights, embodying perfect virtue, generous, brave, pious, and loyal. In practice, knights were human. They were greedy, fearful, vain, ambitious, tired, and occasionally incompetent. Chivalry didn't erase human flaws. It highlighted them, measured them, and sometimes punished them. So why did knights bother? Prestige, social expectation, and the promise of recognition drove them. Following chivalric norms could improve reputation, secure alliances, and enhance economic opportunities. It also provided a framework for behavior in an otherwise violent and unpredictable world. You were dangerous on the battlefield, yes, but your honor dictated that you wield that danger within certain socially acceptable limits. Think of it as an early version of risk management, reputation as insurance against chaos. In conclusion, the code of chivalry was both noble and exhausting. It demanded constant vigilance, moral courage, and social savvy. Knights were expected to be fierce in battle, gentle with women, generous to the poor, loyal to lords, devout to the church, and elegant in manners all at once. Failure was public, success temporary, and the margin for error slim. So next time you imagine a knight in shining armor, remember this. Behind the heroic image was a constant balancing act. Every move was judged, every gesture interpreted, every choice carried social, moral, and sometimes fatal consequences. Knights were not just warriors. They were actors in an ongoing high-stakes performance where honor and reputation weighed as heavily as chainmail and swords. Chivalry promised virtue, but reality delivered stress. It promised glory, but reality demanded calculation. It promised admiration, but reality exacted obedience, loyalty, and sometimes absurdly meticulous social etiquette. And yet, despite all that, knights continued to follow it, because in a world without modern law enforcement, social codes, and hierarchy were the only rules keeping chaos at bay. Chivalry, in the end, was both armor and burden. It protected the knight's honor, but could crush the man beneath it. And in that delicate tension between ideal and expectation, morality and reality, bravery and fear, we begin to see why knighthood was as exhausting mentally as it was physically. Glory was a story written afterward. The real day-to-day of chivalry was negotiation, calculation, and endless, exhausting performance. And sometimes, the best armor you could wear wasn't steel. It was a carefully measured smile, a precise bow, and a mind constantly calculating how to survive the social battlefield just as much as the literal one. If you thought the hardest part of being a medieval knight was swinging a sword in the mud, think again. There was another battlefield, invisible, eternal, and far less forgiving. One that no armor could protect you from, your soul. Religion in the Middle Ages wasn't optional. It was woven into the very fabric of life. From the moment a boy was sent away to be trained as a page, the church's authority was present, shaping conduct, thoughts, and even fear. Knights were expected not only to fight skillfully and uphold honor, but to live morally, piously, and in a way that would secure salvation. And yet, they spent most of their days doing the opposite. killing, raiding, and terrifying people. That's a serious cognitive dissonance. Crusading ideology was central. Knights were told that fighting for the faith was holy, that violence could be righteous if done in God's name. God wills. It was not just a slogan, it was a literal call to action, a moral justification for slaughter. You could wipe out entire towns, and as long as the church approved, you were absolved. In theory, in practice, you still had to wrestle with the human cost. Confession was critical. A knight might spend hours in a dimly lit chapel, kneeling on hard stone floors, whispering scenes into the ear of a priest. "Forgive me, Father, for I have slain." Fill in the blank. The more recent, the graver, the more elaborate the penance. It could be fasting, pilgrimage, monetary donation, or a combination. And here's the kicker. The priest could only forgive what was confessed. Miss one detail. Eternal damnation was still on the table. Imagine trying to recount everything you did in a single battle. The peasants you may have accidentally harmed, the enemy soldiers you killed after they surrendered, the looting you participated in, the oath you broke to save your own skin. Every action had to be justified, explained, rationalized, and cataloged. And of course, you had to do it sincerely. In sincerity. That's right, God knows. And the priest is probably judging too. Even outside of confession, the church monitored knights' behavior. Moral codes, vows of chastity at least outside marriage, honesty, generosity, and charity were expected. You were to protect the weak, serve your Lord faithfully, and maintain pious behavior in both public and private life. Failure to adhere to these expectations could have social consequences: excommunication, loss of prestige, or loss of political favor. And unlike modern society, there was no separation between church, state, and military. These realms were intertwined. The fear of dying unshriven was real. Knights faced mortal danger constantly, and the thought of death while burdened with unconfessed sins could haunt them in camp, on the march, or in the midst of battle. Imagine staring down an enemy charge, hearing the clash of weapons, smelling smoke, and simultaneously thinking, "Am I saved? Have I confessed properly? Will my soul burn for eternity if I die here?" That's pressure the modern mind has a hard time comprehending. And of course, there were indulgences, the medieval equivalent of spiritual coupons. The church promised forgiveness for certain sins, often in exchange for acts of service, money, or participation in crusades. But the system was complex, sometimes arbitrary, and often exploited. Knights could participate in the holy war, kill in the name of God, and feel morally justified, while quietly hoping that their indulgence covered minor transgressions at home. It's not exactly a spa day for the soul, more like juggling fire while blindfolded. Theological tension was constant. How could one reconcile killing with piety, mercy with martial duty, loyalty with morality? Knights had to compartmentalize. You killed on the battlefield, but prayed in the chapel. You swore oaths and broke them in strategy. You sought honor while committing violence. Cognitive dissonance was a survival skill. Some knights handled it by embracing the ideology fully, others by rationalizing actions, and some, probably most, with a healthy dose of selective memory. Crusading campaigns amplified this tension. Traveling thousands of miles to foreign lands, often in brutal climates, knights were expected to fight tirelessly, suffer hunger, disease, and exposure, and maintain spiritual purity. They prayed, fasted, and participated in rituals, all while swinging swords and breaking siege walls. The physical exhaustion of marching was only half the struggle. The moral and spiritual strain added another invisible layer of burden. Even within Europe, daily life was regimented by faith. Knights were expected to attend Mass, give alms, maintain proper decorum, and observe holy days. Failure to do so was not merely impolite, it was socially dangerous. Nobles and peers judged piety alongside martial skill. A knight who fought bravely but ignored religious duties risked ridicule, loss of patronage, or political marginalization. Faith was social currency as much as moral guidance. And let's be honest, there was fear. Fear of damnation, fear of judgment, fear of excommunication, fear of failing publicly and spiritually. Knights were surrounded by people who would happily remind them of these risks. Priests, chroniclers, nobles, and even family members. Imagine navigating that pressure while also facing actual, physical mortal danger daily. Armor could protect you from a sword, but not from the gnawing anxiety of spiritual failure. Knights also had to manage guilt creatively. Some used ritual to cope. Confession, penance, indulgences, pilgrimage. Others relied on superstition or symbolic acts, touching relics, praying before battle, wearing charms. All these mechanisms were attempts to manage the tension between their violent reality and religious ideals. And sometimes humor crept in. A knight might joke about sins with comrades, acknowledging the absurdity of being both saint and slayer. Medieval dark humor, essentially. Yet, despite all this, religion-shaped identity. Knights prided themselves on their spiritual as well as martial prowess. They carried crosses into battle, prayed before combat, and sought God's favor in victory and survival. Faith offered comfort, community, and meaning. It also offered leverage. Performing piety could enhance reputation, attract patronage, and even justify actions that might otherwise be morally questionable. But let's not romanticize this. The constant balancing act, killing and praying, sinning and confessing, surviving and fearing damnation, created a profound psychological toll. Modern studies might call it a form of PTSD filtered through medieval theology. Knights lived with chronic anxiety, guilt, and fear, all compounded by the ever-present threat of physical death. Armor could shield the body. Faith was supposed to shield the soul, but neither offered full protection. In the end, the life of a knight was a negotiation between heaven and earth. You wielded a sword with one hand, a rosary with the other, and hoped that skill, piety, and luck combined would save both body and soul. Religion offered structure and meaning, but it also magnified every failure, every moral compromise, and every moment of hesitation. It was a spiritual battlefield layered atop a physical one, and losing in either could be disastrous. So when you picture a knight kneeling in a chapel, don't imagine serene devotion. Imagine a man weighed down by steel, debt, battlefield horror, social expectation, and the fear that a single misstep might cost him eternity. Prayer was both refuge and pressure point, a delicate balancing act as essential to survival as a well-maintained warhorse or a sturdy lance. The code of chivalry demanded honor. Religion demanded salvation. And in practice, knights often failed to meet either perfectly. They navigated life as best they could, with armor dented, conscience racked, and faith stretched to its limits. In that tension between divine expectation and mortal reality, we see another reason why being a medieval knight sucked more often than it dazzled. Survival was not enough. One had to navigate death, debt, honor, and God's judgment simultaneously. Every battle, every campaign, every joust carried both physical and spiritual stakes. And the irony, the knights, who seemed most heroic in songs and stories, were often those who survived all this stress, luckier, or perhaps better at navigating the labyrinth of morality, duty, and fear. In other words, a knight could conquer an army, charge into fire, and ride away victorious, but still lie awake at night, haunted by guilt, fear, and prayers unanswered. The steel protected the body, but the soul bore its own battles. And in that quiet, unglorified struggle, the moral, spiritual, and psychological stress of everyday knighthood, we glimpse the human cost beneath the myth. If you think the life of a medieval knight was just fighting, jousting, and praying, think again. There's another battlefield entirely, the world of politics, and unlike a physical fight, here your opponent can't be pinned or disarmed. Every move, every loyalty, every handshake could determine whether you survive with your life, your honor, or your land intact. Knights were, in essence, pieces on a chessboard, not the fancy, heroic pieces like queens or rooks, but pawns, expendable, easily sacrificed, yet crucial to the game. Lords needed soldiers to fight their wars, enforce their claims, and demonstrate power. Knights, bound by feudal obligation, often had little choice. Loyalty was demanded, betrayal was punished, yet allegiances could shift without warning. One day, you serve Lord A, the next, Lord B marches to take your lands, and suddenly you're fighting your former ally. Feudal obligations were complicated. A knight could owe service to multiple lords simultaneously. Each demanded attention, each expected obedience. Refuse one, and risk losing favor, land, or life. Accept both, and risk being caught in a conflict not your own. It wasn't a career for the indecisive. Survival often depended more on reading political currents than wielding a sword. And let's be honest, knights were trained to fight, not negotiate. Imagine sending someone into a minefield, giving them a sword, and telling them to also manage complex diplomacy. That was their reality. Betrayal was common. One moment, a knight might swear fealty to a lord. The next, that lord might switch alliances, marry into another family, or claim new territory. Knights who had fought valiantly could suddenly find themselves on the losing side, accused of treachery, or ordered to fight friends and allies. It was a world where yesterday's victory could become today's death sentence. Executions were a constant threat. If a knight backed the wrong lord, or if political tides shifted, loyalty could be recast as treason. Even high-ranking nobles weren't immune. Chroniclers recount countless instances where knights, once celebrated for bravery, were executed or imprisoned because their allegiance became inconvenient. Armor didn't protect you from politics. Steel stopped swords. It didn't stop betrayal. And loyalty itself was complex. Chivalric ideals demanded faithfulness. Social expectation demanded honor. But survival sometimes required pragmatism. Knights had to navigate these contradictions daily. Do you fight for the lord you swore to serve? Or switch allegiance to preserve your lands and family? Do you uphold a promise? Or act strategically to avoid execution or ruin? There was rarely a morally simple choice. Even the mundane details could be dangerous. Attend the wrong feast, sit in the wrong chair, or speak to the wrong person, and rumor could turn against you. Diplomacy and rumor were weapons as sharp as any sword. Knights who failed to manage them could find themselves suddenly isolated, undermined, or accused of plotting against their own lord. Social intelligence was survival, not just courtesy. And then there were arranged marriages and family politics. Alliances were often cemented through marriage, but these arrangements could drag knights into conflicts they hadn't chosen. Marry into the wrong family, and suddenly you owe loyalty across feuds, disputes, and rivalries. Your personal choices were subordinate to political strategy. Love was optional. Survival was mandatory. Sometimes the stakes were economic. Lords often demanded military service to expand territory or secure resources. Knights, obliged to participate, risked life and limb for gains that might not benefit them directly. Campaigns could be exhausting, dangerous, and financially draining. You were paid in prestige, honor, or feudal favors, which were worth far less when you returned, injured, bankrupt, or captured. The chaos of shifting allegiances created constant tension. Knights were trained to strike decisively in battle, but not always to think strategically in politics. One misstep could mean death, loss of land, or public disgrace. Some chroniclers note that battlefield skill alone was insufficient. A politically savvy knight could survive where the strongest warrior fell. In other words, brains sometimes mattered more than brawn. Imagine navigating these politics while already weighed down by armor, debt, battlefield injuries, and the ever-present fear of damnation. Every choice carried layered consequences: physical, financial, social, and spiritual. A knight could be victorious in combat, yet destroyed by politics. Winning a battle might earn you favor today and suspicion tomorrow. The stakes were relentless. The broader context also mattered. Wars were rarely fought for abstract ideals. They were about land, resources, alliances, and power. Knights often found themselves pawns in games far larger than they could comprehend. Lords and kings maneuvered with calculated precision, while individual knights executed orders without full understanding. Obedience was survival. Interpretation was optional. Misread the situation, and it could be your last campaign. Political games could also be unpredictable. Sudden betrayals, shifting allegiances, and feudal disputes meant that today's ally could be tomorrow's enemy. A knight might find himself fighting former comrades or negotiating with enemies he had previously sought to kill. Strategy and adaptability were as critical as swordsmanship. Survival depended on judgment, intuition, and sometimes sheer luck. Ironically, the same system that demanded loyalty and honor also encouraged opportunism. To maintain status, knights sometimes had to play factions against each other, negotiate secretly, or take calculated risks. You could be noble, courageous, and skilled, yet fail entirely if you misread political currents. Armor and sword did not guarantee safety. Judgment did. Humor, if you squint, comes from the absurdity of it all. A knight could spend weeks training, survive battles, capture a castle, and perform heroic feats, only to be executed because a lord changed alliances or a cousin married the wrong person. Medieval life was dramatic, very dramatic, and sometimes utterly ridiculous. In many ways, political games were more dangerous than combat. A knight could survive a siege, dodge arrows, and outmaneuver enemy lances, yet still lose everything because of a rumor, a marriage, or a misjudged loyalty. Steel could protect you from physical wounds, but not from betrayal, manipulation, or the whims of feudal power. It's important to remember that knights were expected to maintain a public image while navigating these treacherous waters. Appearances mattered. You had to seem loyal, courageous, honorable, and competent, all while maneuvering carefully to survive political currents. A single misstep could ruin reputation, alliances, and prospects for survival. In essence, the knight was a performer in a deadly theater where scripts changed daily. So next time you imagine a medieval knight, picture more than armor, swords, and horses. Picture a man or a woman in rare cases constantly calculating, adjusting, and surviving a social and political battlefield that could be as lethal as any enemy army. Every campaign, every feast, every handshake was a potential turning point. Every decision had consequences beyond the obvious. In the end, the life of a knight was not just a physical struggle, but a political tightrope. Loyalty, strategy, and reputation were as important as courage and skill. Many knights fell not because of poor swordsmanship, but because they misjudged alliances, failed to navigate the intricate web of feudal politics, or were unlucky enough to be caught in someone else's game. Being a knight meant being expendable, valuable, and vulnerable all at once. You could be celebrated as a hero one day and executed as a traitor the next. The margin between survival and death was thin, and the battlefield extended far beyond the fighting field, into councils, halls, and feasts where the stakes were invisible but lethal. And that's why we can say with some confidence, the political life of a knight sucked almost as much as the physical life. You needed armor, a sword, and a horse. Yes, but you also needed a sharp mind, impeccable timing, and a fair amount of luck. Miss any of these, and the consequences could be immediate and brutal. So remember this. Knights were warriors, yes, but they were also pawns, diplomats, and social actors in a game much larger than themselves. Victory on the battlefield didn't guarantee safety off it, and the price of a miscalculation could be far steeper than any wound a sword could inflict. In short, swords could defend your body, armor could protect your limbs, but nothing shielded you from the sharp, unpredictable blade of politics. And surviving that game, that was an accomplishment few modern imaginations fully appreciate. If you thought being a knight was tough on the battlefield, brace yourself. Surviving the battle was only half the challenge. The other half, medieval medicine. Or, as some historians might put it, medieval medicine, a charming blend of pain, superstition, and a generous helping of danger. Injuries were routine for knights. Horses tripped, lances shattered, swords cut, arrows flew, and maces crushed. A single charge could leave a man sprawled in mud, teeth broken, ribs cracked, or a limb dangling at a horrifying angle. And if you thought armor guaranteed safety, think again. Plate armor could prevent cuts, but it couldn't protect against concussions, internal injuries, or the simple fact that your horse might fall on top of you. Now, imagine the aftermath. You're alive, maybe conscious, maybe not, bleeding onto cold, uneven ground. Your comrades try to help, but battlefield chaos means there's limited attention, limited resources, and a lot of panic. Once you're carried off, you enter the true horror show, the medieval hospital, or more likely, a tent or castle chamber where the closest thing to modern care involves iron, fire, and the occasional prayer. Let's start with something simple, arrow removal. Seems straightforward, right? Wrong. There were no anesthetics. There were no antiseptics. A surgeon, often a barber surgeon, who cut hair by day, and carved flesh by night, would attempt to extract the arrow using metal instruments while you screamed, flinched, and possibly fainted. Then they might pour a concoction of wine, vinegar, or even crushed herbs into the wound. It was, well, let's call it experimental. Infection rates were sky-high. Some chroniclers suggest that surviving the surgery was luckier than surviving the battle itself. Amputation was common. If a limb was shattered or infected, the solution was often cut it off. With a saw, without anesthesia, without understanding germ theory. The rationale was that infection, gangrene, sepsis, or worse, would spread faster than the pain from losing a hand, foot, or leg. The procedure was quick, brutal, and terrifying. Afterward, the knight would have to deal with shock, blood loss, and the very real possibility that the stump would become infected anyway. Infections were the silent killers. Even small cuts could fester into deadly conditions. Medieval treatment often included poultices of herbs, animal fat, or bread, applied generously to wounds. Sometimes these remedies helped, sometimes they made things worse. Tetanus, gangrene, and other infections had a high fatality rate. A knight could survive a battle with a shattered arm, only to die a week later from an infected wound. Pain management was minimal. Aside from alcohol, opiates, or herbal concoctions, knights had to endure excruciating procedures, fully conscious. Imagine a sword cut across your leg, bone splintering, then a barber surgeon pressing, sawing, and stitching, all while you're awake and aware. And somehow, you're expected to stay stoic, because chivalric expectation demanded courage, even under extreme agony. Modern painkillers, forget it. Ice packs, non-existent. You relied on sheer willpower, adrenaline, and perhaps prayer. Hospital conditions didn't help. Beds were often hard, crowded, and unsanitary. Linens were reused. Flies were everywhere. Sanitation was minimal. Infections spread not just from wounds, but from the environment itself. If you survived surgery, you still had to survive your surroundings. The smell of blood, unwashed bodies, and the omnipresent risk of secondary infection. Some treatments were more theatrical than effective. Leeches for bloodletting, cups for drawing out evil humors, or herbs with questionable efficacy were standard. The idea was that balancing the body's humors would restore health. Science had not yet discovered germs. Magic, superstition, and tradition often guided treatment more than evidence. A knight could survive dozens of battles, only to fall victim to a poorly applied remedy. Permanent disability was common. Broken bones might heal crookedly. Loss of limbs was often irreversible. Vision could be impaired. Chronic pain lingered long after wounds closed. And here's the kicker. Knights had no retirement plans. Injuries could mean the end of a military career and the beginning of economic struggle. You were physically diminished, financially strained, and socially vulnerable. Armor couldn't compensate for a broken body or shattered nerves. Psychologically, injury was isolating. Knights were expected to be stoic, resilient, and endlessly brave. Complaining about pain or disability was frowned upon, and yet the trauma of battle, compounded by the agony of medical treatment, left lasting effects. Modern historians sometimes compare it to early forms of PTSD. Sleep was disrupted, anxiety persisted, the memory of blood, pain, and death haunted many survivors. Steel could protect the body in battle, but it couldn't shield the mind afterward. There was also the social dimension. A knight returning from battle, injured or disabled, had to navigate expectations of competence and honor. A missing limb could affect status, marriage prospects, and reputation. Injured knights might be ridiculed or pitied, even as they were celebrated for surviving the fight. Public perception mattered as much as physical recovery. Survival was only part of the victory. Appearance mattered too. Economically, injuries were disastrous. Repairing armor, replacing weapons, and supporting oneself while incapacitated could strain finances. Families might need to cover costs. Retainers and horses required care. Debts accumulated. Survival didn't just mean living, it meant finding a way to function in a society that valued strength, skill, and presence on the battlefield. Some knights endured repeated injuries over a lifetime. Each wound added cumulative strain. Joints weakened. Mobility diminished. Chronic pain became part of daily life. By the time they aged out of active service, many were physically broken, financially unstable, and still bound by feudal obligations. Knights didn't retire gracefully. They limped into old age, often relying on family or charity, carrying the scars of decades in steel and blood. Humor, if you squint, exists in the absurdity of expectation. Knights were trained to fight, expected to endure extreme pain, and judged harshly if they showed weakness, all while contending with treatments that were, at best, inconsistent, and at worst, life-threatening. Imagine surviving a charge only to be almost killed by your own healer. Dark humor, medieval yet, despite all this, knights continued. Courage, honor, and survival instincts pushed them forward. Pain was part of the job, injury part of the reality. Armor might dent, bones might break, limbs might be lost, but the cultural expectation, the demand to fight, uphold reputation, and maintain stoicism, persisted. Knights didn't have the luxury of quitting. Retreating from the battlefield could carry social death as surely as physical defeat. In summary, injury in medieval knighthood was brutal, unglamorous, and pervasive. Arrows, swords, and horses caused immediate harm. Medieval medicine compounded the danger with pain, infection, and questionable procedures. Long-term consequences included disability, chronic pain, social vulnerability, and financial strain. The life of a knight was physically punishing, not just on the battlefield, but in recovery, treatment, and ongoing survival. So, next time you imagine a knight brushing off a sword cut and hopping back on a horse with a grin, remember this: behind the bravado was a man, often young, often terrified, and often in more pain than you can imagine. Steel could protect the body in battle, but it couldn't stop infection, amputation, or the slow toll of repeated injuries. And it certainly couldn't protect the mind from the fear, trauma, and exhaustion that accompanied each wound. The truth: knights were not superheroes. They were humans enduring extreme conditions with minimal protection, minimal medicine, and maximum expectation. Injuries were inevitable. Surviving them required luck, resilience, and a stubborn refusal to die, or at least, to die in a socially unacceptable way. And in that brutal reality, we begin to see why knighthood was as much a battle of endurance as it was a test of courage or skill. If you thought knighthood was just about charging into battle and wielding a sword like a rock star, here's a reality check. Time catches up with everyone, even the strongest, bravest knights. The life of a medieval knight was punishing, and aging wasn't a gentle retirement plan with rocking chairs and pensions. Nope, it was more like slowly becoming obsolete, while everyone expected you to stay heroic, competent, and fearsome, knights aged fast. Not in the Instagram-filtered way, but in the real, joint-taking, body-breaking, soul-weary way. A lifetime of hard training, repeated injuries, and years spent carrying hundreds of pounds of armor left marks. Knees ground down from long marches, hips stiff from hours on horseback, shoulders sore from swinging swords. Muscles atrophied in spots, while others strained to compensate. And unlike modern athletes with physical therapy, nutrition, and gyms, knights had little help for the wear and tear accumulating in their bodies. The first thing most aging knights noticed was chronic pain. Sprains, broken bones, and the remnants of past injuries didn't heal perfectly, if at all. A misaligned limb, or a poorly healed fracture, could hobble a knight in ways subtle and obvious. Armor might protect you from a blade, but it couldn't prevent arthritis or torn ligaments. Each movement became a negotiation with your own body. Mount the horse carefully, swing the sword strategically, and always avoid landing wrong, because one misstep could undo decades of experience in an instant. Joint damage was widespread. Knees, hips, elbows, and shoulders all bore the brunt of years of combat and training. Even simple tasks, like mounting a horse or swinging a lance in a tournament, became increasingly painful. Yet societal expectation demanded performance. You were still supposed to be brave, capable, and impressive. No whining allowed. Stoicism wasn't optional. It was an obligation. Pain was private, survival public, and then there was financial instability. Knights were not paid salaries in the modern sense. Wealth depended on land, spoils of war, patronage, and marriage alliances. Injuries, aging, and reduced battlefield capability could jeopardize income. A knight who could no longer perform at full strength might be sidelined from campaigns, miss opportunities for ransom payments, or lose patronage. You could be physically alive, but financially broken, forced to live off relatives, charity, or old debts. Armor doesn't pay the bills. Socially, aging knights faced younger competition. The next generation of squires and knights arrived strong, fast, and ambitious. Tournaments, feasts, and even battlefield commands became arenas where experience contended with youth, agility, and ambition. Older knights were expected to maintain respect and authority, while their bodies betrayed them. Every misstep, a missed strike, a slower charge, a faltering in parade, was noticed, sometimes mocked, and often politically consequential. You weren't just fighting enemies anymore. You were fighting. The emotional toll was significant. Imagine spending your life striving for honor, reputation, and glory, only to find your body slowing, your opportunities shrinking, and your relevance fading. There was no early retirement, no pensions, no social safety net, no veterans' assistance. Knighthood was a long, punishing career with an abrupt, sometimes humiliating decline. Aging meant transitioning from active hero to respected elder, if you were lucky enough to survive both battlefield and politics. The cumulative effect of repeated injuries, financial strain, and social pressure often led to bitterness or resignation. Chronic pain made stoicism increasingly difficult. Loss of independence, diminished reputation, and reliance on others for support challenged a knight's identity. The man who once charged fearlessly into battle might now struggle to mount a horse, fearing humiliation or injury. Irony wasn't lost on many. You trained your whole life to be strong, courageous, and honorable, only to be sidelined by the very forces you once mastered. your body, and time. Mortality became more tangible with age. You saw comrades fall, younger knights rise, and the inevitability of death inch closer. Every campaign could be your last. Every joust, every skirmish carried amplified risk. Aging knights had to weigh their ambition against survival carefully. Sometimes stepping back wasn't cowardice, but the only sane choice in a world that demanded constant physical and social vigilance. And yet, experience mattered. Older knights brought strategy, wisdom, and knowledge of warfare that youth could not match. Campaigns relied on these seasoned veterans to advise, command, or train younger knights. But translating wisdom into action required careful adaptation. You couldn't charge as fast, lift as much, or recover as quickly. Mentorship became a survival tool, passing on knowledge to keep your legacy alive, while adapting to diminishing physical prowess. Chronic pain, financial stress, political vulnerability, and social pressure all compounded. The body was failing, the mind was exhausted, and yet expectation demanded continued performance. Aging knights often carried invisible scars as heavy as any war wound. The mind and spirit bore a burden compounded by decades of danger, responsibility, and cultural expectation. Even mundane tasks became dangerous. Mounting a horse could be treacherous for stiff joints. Swinging a sword in practice could reopen old injuries. Sleeping on hard beds after campaigns aggravated aches. Everyday life was a negotiation between ambition, necessity, and physical limitation. The knight's world didn't slow down to accommodate aging. You had to adapt or pay the price. Some knights retired quietly to estates or monastic life, finding solace in prayer, hunting, or administration. Others clung to the battlefield, unwilling to relinquish honor or relevance. Some fell into poverty, disabled and alone, with their past glories remembered only in song or rumor. Few enjoyed a peaceful decline. Most faced a slow erosion of body, wealth, and social standing. The psychological impact of aging out of active service was profound. Knights were defined by their ability to fight, command, and uphold honor. Loss of mobility or capability challenged identity. Stoicism, expected for decades, now became a mask for fear, frustration, and grief. Mental resilience was tested as harshly as physical endurance ever had been. Ironically, aging knights could be at once revered and marginalized. Their experience commanded respect in councils or training grounds, but battlefield effectiveness often defined reputation. Being older and slower didn't erase skill, but perception mattered. The public and younger peers often valued vitality over wisdom. Relevance became a constant negotiation between reality and expectation. Humor exists, dark as it may be. Knights who survived wars and tournaments sometimes found themselves outpaced by youthful squires in drills, mocked for failing to mount a horse quickly, or remembered more for stooping underweight than for glorious charges. It's a reminder that even legends are human, vulnerable, aging, and occasionally ridiculous. In short, aging was an unrelenting reality of knighthood. Physical decline, chronic pain, financial instability, social competition, and psychological strain combined to make the later years of a knight far less heroic than their prime. Survival required adaptation, mentorship, and sometimes humility, qualities that were as crucial as courage and swordsmanship, but rarely celebrated in tales or songs. So, as we imagine the veteran knight, picture a man hardened by decades of combat, worn by armor and battles, navigating politics, debt, and social expectation. Every joint aches, every step is a negotiation, every decision carries weight. Yet experience provides insight. Wisdom, mentorship, and strategy allow survival even when physical prowess fades. Steel may protect the body, but time, injuries, and expectations are merciless. Being an aging knight was a balancing act between honor, survival, and relevance. You fought not only enemies, but your own body, changing social landscapes and shifting political pressures. Glory was fleeting, survival was complicated, and even when a knight retired or survived to old age, the mental, physical, and financial scars of decades of punishing service remained. Silent witnesses to a life far more exhausting than legend would suggest. In the end, the knight who ages gracefully is less a hero of battle and more a survivor of endurance. Steel may dent, swords may break, and enemies may fall, but time spares no one. Armor can protect the body, but it cannot slow the march of years. And in that quiet, gradual decline, we see a truth often overlooked. The life of a knight, glorious in legend, was relentless, exhausting, and unforgiving in reality. So the next time you see a knight in shining armor riding proudly across a battlefield, you'll know the truth behind the legend. Yes, there was honor. Yes, there was status. But there was also exhaustion, fear, crushing financial pressure, painful injuries, and a lifetime of expectations that started in childhood. Knighthood wasn't just a title, it was a relentless commitment to warfare, loyalty, and survival in a world where one mistake could cost you everything. In many ways, it was less of a fairy tale and more of a full-time risk. What surprised you the most about a knight's life? The brutal training, the heavy armor, the constant danger. Let me know in the comments. I always enjoy hearing what stood out to you. If you found this deep dive into medieval reality interesting, please take a moment to like the video. It really helps the channel grow and reach more history lovers. And if you haven't already, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss another exploration into the gritty truths behind the past. When you're ready for another journey, check out the related videos on your screen, whether it's medieval weddings, daily life in castles, or the real stories behind legendary rulers. There's always more history waiting to be uncovered. Until next time, stay curious, and remember, the past was rarely as glamorous as it looks in armor. I'll see you in the next story.